Good afternoon. Welcome to Discovering Creativity. I am Maud Manzi. I'm a graduate student at Texas A&M. And I would like to first start off by asking our guest if she could briefly introduce herself.
Sure. My name is Janet Storms, and I am the owner of a small LLC called Learning on the Verge. And I provide trainings for mostly federal government employees, but also for nonprofit organizations on budgeting, but also the integration of creativity, thinking, and principles. So that's sort of just a general intro. Hopefully that's what you're looking for, Ma.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Would you prefer I call you Janet throughout the rest of the interview or Miss
Yes,
Storm?
please. Janet
Perfect.
would be
Thank you
great.
so much, Janet. Would you first start off by kind of talking about what is the methodology that you kind of bring to creative thinking when you start consulting with companies?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I have a background in two very different areas. One is federal budgeting and appropriations, and the other is dance and nonprofit dance companies, actually. And I've taught dance for probably over 40 years, but I was in the federal government career for about 24, 25 years. And the question I kept asking myself is, how can we improve the budget process? It needs the process itself, which should help organizations become successful, deliver on their missions and all of that. How can we work on that? And so I kept thinking that creativity would be a really useful sort of provide a useful framework for how do we improve the budget. So really I went to grad school at SUNY Buff State, and that was the focus of all of my studies, looking at creativity, creative principles, but also the budget process. And so what I do now is work with mostly public sector organizations, nonprofits, and government agencies. And I teach budgeting, but I always try to integrate into it the creative principles. So that's really what my type of work I do. I also, in addition to doing workshops and trainings, I have done some consulting and looking at an organization's processes, budget process, strategic planning process, and looking at ways for making them more effective.
Thank you so much. That's actually a really great point. So as you're bringing in these creative solutions, what does creativity mean to you in that sense of what you're trying to bring to these companies and change their mindsets?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Maud. What I believe is that creative thinking and creative problem solving, we call that CPS, provides a structure to determining what the problem is. What is the challenge that you're trying to address? Meeting with your stakeholders early enough in the process so that you have their input. So often what I saw with stakeholders, especially outside of the organization, were brought in way too late in the process. And so then the organization is having to oh my goodness, this isn't what the stakeholders were looking for. How do we fix it? To me, bringing in creative problem solving, where you look at the actual problems, you spend time coming up with ideas, those wild and crazy ideas. But then through integration with your stakeholder input and all of that, you begin to refine it. Also, I think that creative problem solving and creative thinking helps with transparency. Because too often I have found that organizations' budget processes involve only maybe the senior leadership, maybe the budget office, the CFO's office, program offices, those offices that are actually trying to implement their programs, oftentimes are out of the loop a bit. To me, creative problem solving, creative thinking helps an organization to bring in the program offices if you need to find out what's going on. So in my mind, the creative problem solving, 4 phases, and creative thinking really help to not just improve the budget process, but begin to link strategic planning with budgeting, which is really difficult for many organizations to do.
I think that's a really good point, Janet, as you bring up kind of bringing those stakeholders in early, especially when you're talking about people get very, right, speaking from your experience as a federal employee, myself as a federal employee, it's easy to get kind of, you want to bring that creative solution in, but it's getting not only those low level stakeholders, but also your upper level stakeholders in at that same time, that same point, so that everyone is sharing that transparency of what is that unity of effort towards the next goal. So I was wondering, can you share with us some effective ways that you've demonstrated the value of those creative solutions early on to those stakeholders?
Sure. And really, it's from my experience, it's more ways to avoid problems that agencies have faced or organizations have faced. These are tools. And an example, I did a workshop with a group of nonprofit organizations. And what one of the issues is, and this is true for any organization, the solution to a problem is we need more money. That is most likely the first response you get. But what if there isn't more money? What if you have to actually figure out how to do something within your existing budget? There is a choreographer named Liz Lerman who one of my favorite quotes is, think inside the box. Let limitations inspire creativity. So if the budget process is transparent and everybody understands what those limitations are, now your frontline individuals, oh, I've got to think about this in a different way. So the creative process actually helps to work within the constraints. So often I think people think, oh, creativity and innovation, that's going to cost us a lot of money or a lot of resources. But in fact, if an agency or an organization builds these creative processes from the beginning in their strategic plan, now everybody's on the same page. And now everyone can work together. They now know what the constraints are. I think some of the frustration in organizations is they don't know what the constraints are. They're told, oh, here's a great idea, but then they're said, oh no, we can't do that. Right? So yes. that is what I found when I was doing this workshop. But truly, when I was in the federal government, I found that same situation. So I feel, and the way I present it is, here is a way to make your strategic planning and budget process more effective by thinking about when should we ideate, when should we come up with those ideas, not at the end, early on, ideally maybe even in the strategic planning process. When should we refine? When should we evaluate? That, and so what I tried to do, what I have done is I have developed a budget model that actually specifies when you do these things. So.
And that's super interesting, Janet. So when you're talking about this budget model, is it able to be scaled based on not only the company, but maybe the time that is allotted to the company or organization to make those impacts?
Yes. And in fact, and since you are a federal employee, you may have experienced a series of different models. And oh, we got to throw everything out that we did before and start all over. And I don't want organizations to have to do that. I want them to look at their existing strategic planning and budget model and figure out what adjustments can we make. Also, absolutely scaling from a small nonprofit like my dance company. We were 12 people, very small. There's certain things that maybe we didn't need to worry about, but other things would totally be relevant. A larger, more complex federal agency, absolutely, there is very mandated timeframes. If you're a nonprofit and you have to submit grants, those drive your timeframes. So yes, the intent of this model is more to offer an opportunity for an organization to step back and say, okay, what's working? What is not working in our current processes? What can we take from creative problem solving? And here are the places that we could put them in our annual process. Does that make sense?
It does. And I wonder, and I'm curious of how, when you're bringing it in, how do you gain ownership within an organizational culture and climate, right? Because that's often something that you have to face, is looking at those constraints so rigidly as, well, we can't do it because of X.
Yes.
How do you find your approach of encourages creativity without kind of without so much so that you're going against organizational culture, in a way that you're bringing that culture to the organization, if that makes sense?
Oh, it totally does. And I am the first to admit that integrating creative problem solving and creative thinking into very structured and inexistent business processes requires some level of culture change. Absolutely. You can't change the processes without changing the culture. Senior leadership buy-in is critical. And what I have found, several organizations, one's a federal agency and a couple of nonprofits, what they've come to me with is, I don't have the information I need to make the decisions. What can you suggest in terms of changes to our process so that the board of the nonprofit organization or the leadership, the decision makers in an agency, have the information they make? And I have to say, I hadn't thought about that, but that is a consistent sort of comment I've gotten, and that is what's driven some nonprofits and federal agencies to look at this. The other thing that I have seen, and I know this is the difficult part, is when I have taught using budget as a strategic tool, which is what I call my workshop. I'm very careful about using the word creativity and budget together for historic reasons. So it's really about using the budget as a strategic tool. I have gotten where the individuals who have taken that class come away and they go, oh my gosh, I see exactly where in our organization we could apply this. But I don't know if they actually were able to do that, because it was a training session, right? A workshop where I don't know if they were able to bring it to their senior leadership. But there are things that absolutely an office could change, right? Internal to theirs within the broader structure. Because again, my focus is not in saying my way is the only budget process that works. It's really a series of concepts, tools, and principles that I'm encouraging nonprofits and agencies to integrate into their strategic plan and budget process. But yes, culture change is huge.
I find it very interesting, Shanna, as you talked about that, as you rebranded creativity as strategic planning. Why do you think that misconception exists at some of these more rigidly structured communities, where they want to veer away from the term creativity and maybe put it in like more of a traditional context? Like, why is that misconception existing?
Well, I think it's historic. And I think one of the challenges of anyone who is working with any type of an business, they're looking at success, they're looking at, you know, meeting their bottom line, they're looking at meeting their mission, whatever it might be. And historically, I think the word creativity sounds a little soft, right? So in general, I think there is that problem. Now, I have to say, I think it's changing. As innovation, and that's the interesting thing to me, innovation, which is the implementation of creative ideas, that is something organizations say they need, right? We need to innovate. We need to stay up with what is the rapidly changing world and all of this. So I do think it's changing. But the issue specifically with budget, the phrase creative budgeting historically has meant made up numbers, maybe not being totally transparent, maybe not being totally based on actual real budget estimates, right? That's where my sensitivity comes in most strongly when I'm trying to open a federal agency or a nonprofit organization to this idea that there is a role for creativity, creative thinking in specifically the budget process. I'm not talking about just generally in the organization. I'm actually saying if you actually change your budget process, you're establishing a more innovative, flexible, accountable organization. So that's why I use this word of strategic budgeting or using the budget as a strategic tool, because ultimately that is the delivery. That's the deliverable, right? If it's a strategic tool that helps an organization achieve what they want to do, become successful, okay, that's one of the ways we're going to get there. So that's sort of the two reasons why.
And then as you're talking about kind of bringing them in and looking at those approaches and bringing in strategic budgeting, I actually am curious, what is the catalyst that drives either the agency or the nonprofit to reach out to your workshop? Do you often find that it is the same catalyst, or do you think it's kind of driven by a want within like the lower stakeholders, the higher stakeholders? Where do you feel that approach gets triggered by the companies of, we need someone else to come in here and teach us this model?
It is this idea that the organization isn't achieving what they want to achieve. And this idea that budgeting is all about constraints, right? That it's bean counting, or it's separate from our implementation. And so it could be the CFO, the budget director, saying, you know what, we need to understand how the budget process feeds into the actual day-to-day, because there is, in many organizations, the budget happens over here. I don't know what goes on over there. All I know is I get my number at the end of the day. It has nothing to do with what I really need and when I needed it and what I needed it for. I don't understand that. So I do come back to it. And maybe it's because organizations, when they decide to do a training or have consulting services, it is at more of a leadership level. So I can't speak to what conversations were going on in the organization before they decided they would like this. What I have found is when I do trainings or workshops, I find that the participants get excited, because suddenly it's like, oh, the budget, I understand something. I understand a little bit more. And here is how I could maybe use it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, the budget should provide a structured framework for that kind of input throughout the organization. So anyways, but I think at least in terms of reaching out to me specifically, it has been more at the leadership level.
Oh, completely understood. Do you think when you're talking about that excitement that it's that first time maybe those stakeholders are realizing that that limitation that they saw now is giving them more opportunities and they're finally being provided that chance to explore those opportunities in an environment that encourages it versus it being just a straight no? Instead of it being no, it becomes a yes if.
Or a yes and.
Yes and type mentality.
You want the yes and, right? You know, I'm thinking specifically about, and I'm not going to give any specifics, but about a participant who took one of my workshops, and I had everybody spend time identifying their stakeholders. Each of the participants take your program. Who are your stakeholders? And then I had them each work on a problem. They brought a problem from their work, and we went through the creative problem solving process in a budget context. And this individual came up to me and said, "Oh my goodness, we work with states and local governments, and we're trying to figure out how to, distribute or do our grants or whatever it might be. This helps us make that decision. This process could help us make that decision." So that was a very program specific situation. And he came up to me after the workshop and said, "I totally can see where I can use it within my program." So that's what I'm talking about when I say it doesn't necessarily mean the entire agency. It could be that individual or that individual program.
That's incredibly interesting because it is that moment of almost empowerment that they
Yes.
feel like now they can understand. And oftentimes I feel like when you do kind of get into those rigid constructs of we have all of these due outs, all of these people want a piece of the pie of the budget. These are the limitations, these are your constraints. Having to vocalize that, but then also organize it in a way that can be consumed by higher up often becomes the biggest challenge in my mind of whenever I've dealt with a budget of I work on shifts and then you have these 5 jobs that need to get fixed. And you're like, well, who gets the money?
Yes.
And it's sitting down and deciding amongst us of like, what are we bidding for and where does that money need to go? Do you think that as you kind of provide that approach in your trainers, are you seeing it more only at that leadership level that you talked about, or do you see sometimes a mix of stakeholders?
Mix. And I think one of the most for the workshops I teach, I think what I have seen, at least in the workshop, where the light bulbs go off is when they think about their stakeholders and when should they get their input. And what does that mean about our strategic plan? What does that mean? And for prioritizing, you have so much money and you can only fund 4 out of the 5 projects. How do you prioritize them without information from your stakeholders, without a strategic plan that helps you guide your priorities? That it's, when I've done these workshops, that is the area that people are like, oh my gosh, the budget links to what we're actually trying to accomplish. And when you talk about stakeholders, and stakeholders not just outside of the organization, inside the organization, because suddenly leadership is a stakeholder, right? If you're in a program office, just like you say, you're spending so much time trying to justify up. Well, knowing who those are and and then you begin to think about it from the beginning. How do we present the information so it's relevant to them? How do we present this information and justify our budget numbers so that they understand why they got to approve it and move it up, right? And it just is at every level. So for me, when I've taught these workshops, whether it's the leadership or program, that's where we get the really great sort of discussion, because it just naturally leads to these other things. The other place that the other part of the workshop that I get really great discussion from is this idea of, what is it you actually need next year? Okay. And the example I use is, there's a nonprofit and they say, we need to start a new program. So they put in a grant for a new program. They get the money for the grant, and then suddenly they say, oh, wait a minute, we need some research. Oh, wait a minute, we need to reach out to our stakeholders to know exactly. So really what they needed money for was the research, the investigation part of it. That is reputationally can hurt a nonprofit, can hurt an agency if they justify for a certain reason. They do get the money. Everyone's like, okay, let's see it. And then they go back to the funders, whether it's Congress or the local government or a foundation, and say, oh, well, actually, we need to take a step back, or we need to change. That is the other time in my workshops where it's happened to everybody. It's not unique to, and so they're like, okay, now how do we develop a strategic planning and budget process to minimize that that's going to happen in the future? So that's the other time where I've gotten just some great discussions in the workshops.
And that's a super interesting, as you bring up with the workshops, how everything is working together and they acknowledge that. I'm actually curious, with your workshops, do you do just like a series at one point, or do you actually have points where you go back to the same company, back to the same agency, maybe 6 months later, a year later, to see how that ownership that you saw kind of get built and that process you saw get built, how it survives past maybe first contact, second contact?
And it's so interesting, Maud, that you asked that question, because, I'm a small one-person nonprofit, LLC. This is exactly the piece I wish that I could build in.
Nice. Okay.
Because I haven't figured that out. How do you can't force anyone to take a follow-on workshop. You can't force anyone to hire you again. You can encourage, I'd love to hear back. I'd love to hear. So what, unfortunately, from my experience, what I have seen is that initial part. And I am trying to figure out, how do I build in this sort of follow-up? Because that's the piece. It will help me, right? It'll help me with my workshops and consulting. But that is a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you right now.
No, I always love to see it as we talk about kind of like you bring in these innovative processes. And I feel like it's something that, right, I see as a federal employee, we get very, very excited. We're all about it. We spend 3 months building it, implementing it. And then we slowly, right, either due to operational tempo, other constraints, we go back to be like, oh, well, that's a no. Right? You get told no. And so you immediately, within that budget constraint, be like, we can't do it. That's a no. So we have to, I'm always curious to see how that how it survives.
Yeah. And I think that's why, and I had almost a 25-year career in the federal government. And I saw this happen all the time. And I think that's why, as someone who's trying to improve the budget process, that is exactly why I try to focus on these principles and these tools, because those you can take in, whether you have to submit it to Office of Management and Budget, or whoever else it is that you can still use these principles and tools. But yeah, this is the challenge. I don't want, and I also, the other part, and this is part of why I bring strategic planning into my process, is I saw too many strategic plans. We spent months on it, and then it sat on a shelf and gathered dust. And then I'd be asking on the budget, well, how does it fit? And it's like, oh, well, let's go take that. And then it was sort of artificial. Well, I'm not going to use the word artificial, superficial linkages between strategic planning and budget. That to me is really not a good business practice, right? You want the strategic plan to help drive the budget. And there's a lot in the federal government that's being done to try to do that, but it is on the day-to-day level, like you say, it's really hard. And so that's why I try to focus on those linkages, to try to, the hope is you strengthen those linkages, you integrate these certain tools and aware of the principles, and it survives.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The one other thing I quickly want to just mention, because you did mention it, is, and it's creative problem solving, they say it up front.
Yes.
It's not for everything. I am not at all proposing that the creative problem solving process be used to calculate rent costs or utility costs or those types of things. But I believe it's important to look at your budget to decide, do we have any new programs? Do we have any really huge changes in our environment? Do we have something that's going away? Then you say, okay, we're going to need to use these tools and principles in these areas. But I just don't want anyone to come away saying, oh my gosh, we're never going to have time to do all of this. It's selective, but putting that question up front, I think helps agencies and nonprofits and other organizations decide, right? Oh, these are our fixed costs. We know that these are, but here are things that are potentially going to change. Okay, now we will focus on those as we develop our budget.
Oh, that's absolutely a great way to wrap up, Janet, especially talking about creative problem solving, not apply to everything. But I want to thank you so much for speaking to me about how you look at budgeting, creating that strategic plan, and then using creative problem solving to look for those opportunities within those constraints.
That was a great summary. Yes, thank you, Maud. I really enjoyed it, and have a great day.
You too.